So guys, we're halfway through the growing season and a very specific problem is happening in the garden, and I imagine this is happening all across the country, and in many countries this happens. But when you get too much rain, all sorts of problems can happen. We've harvested tons of vegetables this year, tons of fruits, and it's all working quite well, but we're starting to see some problems happening because of the excessive rain. So I'm going to take you around the garden and show you some things that are happening, and then we'll go inside the greenhouse and I'll show you a very simple fix to keep your garden healthy and correct some of the problems that are happening. Once this begins, you really have to take action right away, or your garden will continue to decline to the point where you'll lose most of your plants, and your fruit production, your vegetable production will almost go to zero. So when you see issues like this squash is really starting to wilt terribly, and we're starting to see browning of the leaves, and I'm also starting to see some diseases forming on the leaves. So this is one thing you need to get under control. I'll show you a couple of other spots on tomatoes, but this is a really easy fix if you catch it early. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, these tomatoes looked very healthy and they were producing non-stop. But as you can see, there's a lot of browning of the leaves and a lot of wilting. We've just had too much rain, massive amounts of rain. So I'm going to show you what to do and how to correct the problem. Let's head into the greenhouse and we'll get started on that. Now, I love it when it rains out in the garden because I don't have to worry about watering, and I've got an automatic shutoff that prevents the automatic irrigation system from continuing to water up to 24 hours after a good solid rain, maybe even up to 72 hours I can set it for. But there's a few things that happen when we have too much rain. You have a problem with soil saturation, which means the roots are going to drown because of lack of oxygen. Another thing that can happen is you can have fungal diseases started, which means you're going to have to treat the leaf surfaces with this very special product, and I'll get to that in just a second. So that's one of those things that we want rain in the garden because it saves us a lot of energy and it saves us a lot of time, and if our water bills get expensive, it saves us a lot of money. So there's a few things, like I said, that can happen when we get too much rain. Now, a couple more things that can happen are you can have nutrient lockout. When the soil is waterlogged and consistently wet, there's not as much available nutrients for the plant to absorb, so that happens very easily. So it's just really a tragedy in the garden when you have a massive amount of rain. We think it's going to help the garden, and it actually does the complete opposite. And so the last thing that can happen is you can have stunted growth in your plants. Even though you feel like your garden is very well fertilized and you have everything perfectly, have good airflow, excessive water can cause stunted growth, and root rot is the reason that often happens. So your roots suddenly become too mushy, and they will turn from a nice white color to a brownish mushy color, and so that can kill the plants faster than anything. If you're planting your vegetables or whatever you're planting in small pots, you can sometimes lift them out and get a better inspection of the roots. But in the case of this garden, it's hard for me to lift anything out without digging it up and damaging the root system. So that's just a few things that can happen when we have excessive rain. So let me show you the cures for having too much rain. So before I show you the product we're going to use to stop the root rot and all the other issues with excessive rain, I'm going to show you a couple of mechanical methods. Now, this is some leftover pond liner that I've had around the greenhouse. I have tons of it because I have 2 or 3 different ponds throughout the property, and I use pond liner to keep the soil from drying out and keeping our fish alive. But using something like this pond liner can be found, you can buy it online, I'll put a link in the description, or you can go to your local hardware store and they'll have it. This one is a really high quality one, but what I've done is I've cut a square pattern, and you can cut circles or whatever you have depending on how many plants you have in each bed. But to cover up a specific pot, I'm going to do this because I want to see if I can get the soil dried out enough for it to survive. Then you're going to cut up a slit out of the middle of your liner, and like I said, it can be round, it doesn't have to be square. And then I've cut a small triangle there so I can put it around the base of the plant. So we can, the next 3 days we're expecting nothing but rain. So I want to put this on that pot to get it dried out because it's just too wet, and I don't want to go to all the trouble of repotting it. Now, if you don't have pond liner, you could remove the plant from the soil and remove as much of the soil you can, and then do a remix with a very, very well draining soil mixture. I'll put a link in the description of how to make your own high quality soil. But basically, using something like perlite will make the soil lighter, and so you go from a very heavy soil to a very light soil, and the water can drain out much faster. Of course, you have the opposite problem in a drought situation. The water will not be retained well in the pot or in the ground if you have too much perlite. So just remember, there's a balancing act there. Now the way you can also aerate the soil mechanically is you can use something like these stakes. I use these in the tomatoes all the time. You can also use, if you're dealing with a small potted plant, you can use chopsticks and even a painter stir stick. You're wanting to push them down into the soil, and it's not going to hurt the roots, because actually if you break any roots when you're doing this, it will help stimulate growth. One of the first things I learned in gardening is pruning stimulates growth, whether you're talking about above the ground or below the ground. Now you can over prune above or below, but just remember, doing this is not going to harm it. So just poke as many holes around the plant, whether we're talking tomatoes, cucumber, squash, eggplant, peppers, and just put maybe 20 to 30 holes to allow more oxygen to get to the root system, whether it's a very small plant in a pot or a very large plant that's planted in a raised bed like mine. So before we use this product, we want to do an inspection of our plant in the ground or in the pot. We want to look for standing water. We want to see if there's a foul odor near the root ball, which could be a sign of root rot. And you just want to make sure that there's no yellowing leaves. If all that's occurring, you probably do have the beginning of a root rot issue or probably a disease problem from too much rain. A lot of people don't understand what happens to their garden middle way through the summer if they've had a lot of rain, and that's usually it. It's not that the garden hasn't been properly cared for, it's just you have too much of one thing that's initially great for the garden, which is water, but when it becomes too much, your garden can suffer through disease and rotting of the roots. So this involves both foliar treatment and treating the soil area. So let's talk about foliar treatment first. You're just taking regular 3% hydrogen peroxide. We're going to take 1 ounce to a gallon, and in a container this size I can treat my entire garden very thoroughly, and I believe this is 4 gallons, I believe it is. So we're going to take 4 ounces of this, put it in our sprayer, fill it up with water, and then we're going to treat very heavily all throughout the garden, everything, peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, everything, and be sure to spray the undersides of the leaves as well, because we've got to knock out any of those diseases that could occur after we've had just non-stop rain week after week. Now the time you'll want to do this is early morning before 9 a.m., before the sun gets high in the sky, and it can have some detrimental effects on your garden. You can have some leaf scorching happening. So I would absolutely recommend spraying the entire garden early. I'll put a link in the description to these, but if you want a really inexpensive, I believe it's about $10 or $15. It's called a solo sprayer, and you can easily treat one plant at a time, but you'll have to refill it a lot more frequently than one of these battery powered backpack sprayers that I can do the entire garden in less than 30 minutes. So if you confirmed you had root rot and you can smell something, or you've dug a little bit around the roots and you can see that they've kind of changed to a mushy brown color instead of a healthy white color, one of the things you can do is do a much stronger treatment to try to get everything back in order. You can do a 1 part hydrogen peroxide to 2 parts water. You don't want to do this unless you have confirmed that you have root rot. The normal formulation for the soil drench is a lot weaker, and I'll go over that in just a second. So just remember, if you have root rot and you know it for sure, you do that 1 part to 2 parts water, 1 part hydrogen peroxide, 2 parts water. I want to make sure I repeat myself, because this is the strongest you want to mix it once you know that your plant has a serious disease from excessive watering and rain. Now the standard soil drench formula is a lot weaker. We don't put as much in there. We're going to put 1 part hydrogen peroxide to 4 parts water. For instance, if we were mixing this in gallons, it would be 1 gallon of hydrogen peroxide and 4 gallons of water. So you're not going to need that much, because we're just treating a small area at the root base. So unless you're treating a very large garden, you won't have to mix it by gallons, so you won't need to buy but maybe one of these and just mix it in a lot smaller dosage. So just remember, the soil drench method is a lot weaker, but we're trying to stop any diseases and root rot from forming up under the soil. Now when you're doing the soil drench method, you want to make sure that you stay within about 6 to 12 inches right of the root ball. You want to concentrate this right there where the roots are. You want to make sure that you don't allow puddling. You just want to gently water around the base so we can reverse this issue of too much rain and the microbes that have taken over, the bad microbes that have taken over. There's a way to reverse this, how you can add in good microbes to bring your plant back once you've killed off the bad bacteria and microbes. Now not every plant is going to succumb to this issue of too much rain, but there's at least a dozen plants in the garden that I know have. So I've mixed my mixture and I'm going to go out and treat it, but I'm going to do this about every 3 to 5 days until I see some recovery taking place, new growth starting, and we can trim away the bad leaves, the yellowing and wilted leaves, to encourage new growth above the soil line. Now once we've done this process for 2 or 3 weeks and we're starting to see some recovery in our plants, we want to add beneficial bacteria and microbes back into the soil. Now this mycorrhizal fungi, this product is in a liquid form. You can buy it online, and I'll put a link in the description. Or if you make compost tea, you can add compost tea. But you want to wait till the soil is nice and dry before you do that, because you don't want to make the problem worse by adding a liquid to the soil when it's still very, very saturated. Now, if you do dig up the plant and you're wanting to replant it, you want to make sure that it's well draining. You don't want to put it in an area that's low lying where water is going to stand, but you can add things like pine bark or perlite or even baked clay. There's a baked clay product that I've seen online. I haven't been able to find it lately. I bought it actually directly from the store, but if I do see it online, I'll put a link in the description. But those things all help the soil to be a little bit looser and drain a little bit more freely. So that's where this problem really begins, is not having enough things like perlite or pine bark, things that will aid in the quick draining of the soil after a heavy rain. So this little device is one of the most important things you can have in your garden. If you're like me and you get massive amounts of rain during the summer, this can tell you about the moisture issues further down than just where you could test with your finger. You can test the first 2 to 3 inches with your finger to get a feel for how wet the soil is. But something like this, you can go nearly a foot down and you can see what's happening farther down in the soil. And so everyone talks about the finger test. That's great. But if you've got a lot of mulch on the surface, you need to be able to get further down into the soil so you can see if your plant truly needs to be watered or if it's dried out. Now, if you know that your summers are going to be excessively rainy, because they've been that way in the past, and it's kind of a hit and miss with us here in the southeastern part of the United States. But if you know that you're going to have a very, very rainy upcoming summer, there's a couple of things you can do when you plant your garden. You can hill the soil up, and you can plant the plant a little bit higher than the normal ground level. Also, you can dig trenches. Even if you're in raised beds, you can dig a trench so the water kind of goes down and funnels itself out that during a heavy rain event. So making sure the roots have a little bit more chance to dry out is being a little bit higher up and water moving away from the plant more quickly. So our goal here is just to provide more oxygen to the soil, and that's where the hydrogen peroxide and the mechanical measures come into place, is that we're trying to dry the soil and get it to be more oxygenated. So just remember that adding any other chemicals to this hydrogen peroxide is a really bad idea. We're doing this just to help revive the plant and give it a chance to recover. So if we want to fertilize, we need to wait about that until we've done this process, so it can kind of make a little bit of a recovery so we don't send it further into decline. So guys, if you have a question about this video or any previous video, I hope you'll become a public subscriber first, because I put those people to the front of the line when it comes to questions and comments. It's really almost impossible for me to respond to 100 to 300 comments a day, because I have so many other things going at the same time. So if you'd like me to answer a question, again, do that, become a subscriber, and that would be greatly appreciated, and I'll get back to you as quickly as possible and give you the most accurate answer I can to any questions you have. Guys, have a great day.